So what we're doing today is, in terms of, we're here based in Wellington at the One Mindful Breath point where we meet every Wednesday night. And how we've got it set up is we've got a screen that's facing the audience, but in terms of the interview, it's just me doing the interview. So the camera's on me, but there's actually a whole audience of people behind me. Hello. So firstly, I thought I'd start off just by introducing the person who's going to be speaking, which is going to be, of course, Winton Higgins. This is the launch for his book, Revamp, Writings on Secular Buddhism. So Winton was a lecturer in politics at Macquarie University in Sydney up until 2000, and then he was an associate in international studies at the University of Technology in Sydney. And he's also a creative writer at the same time. So I've read his one of his more recent books, Rule of Law, which was around the Holocaust, and Nuremberg Trials, which was a great book. What he's also known for is, of course, as being a Buddhist practitioner and a teacher of insight meditation since 1995. And he's contributed significantly to the development of secular Buddhism internationally, and is a senior teacher for the Sydney Insight Meditators, and I think with the Kookaburra Sangha in Sydney as well. And so firstly, what we're going to do is just have Winton just talk briefly about the book, and then what we're going to be doing is having some questions. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Winton. Thank you.
Right. Well, I didn't prepare anything because I thought it was just going to be a dialogue, but okay, the book is, it's things I've written in the last 8 years. At the beginning of the book, there are two fairly long essays that were published in the online journal, Journal of Global Buddhism. And then there's a talk I gave in at the Barry Centre for Buddhist Studies in 2013 at a colloquium on secular Buddhism. And the rest of it is basically talks that I've given over the last 8 years. Towards right at the end of the book, there are two fairly long essays that began as talks, but which I've sort of edited a bit to make them sort of flow with the earlier contents of the book. So it's not a sort of totally one step, next step, and a further step kind of book, but into the issues that are facing secular Buddhism. So it's I've put the way I put it together was that I got everything I thought was relevant or hung together, and then I've edited it to get what is called in hoity-toity circles as a discursive arc running through it. So there's some sort of coherence that's going from A to B, as it were. So it's in many ways fairly close to Stephen Batchelor's perspectives on secular Buddhism, but it also includes some of my favourite philosophers and psychoanalysts who I think are important, and towards the end also it converges with what I was doing in my day job in terms of social and political analysis, because one of the barrows I'm pushing is that there is, given that Buddhism as a whole is a task-based ethical practice, ethics don't stop at the bedroom door, but rather they must be about how we manifest in the world, and particularly in the social and political world. Because unlike former times, like the times when Buddhism began, politics really matter now in terms of saving the planet and solving the other great crisis that we faced on a global scale, which is massive social injustice and massive social exclusion. And the two crises are linked in ways that put great pressure, I think, on anyone who's leading a reflective life to actually get active around. So I'll leave it there, and you can start asking the questions.
Oh, thank you, thank you, Winton. The one thing which I was really interested in reading the book, and I've been lucky enough to get a pre-publishing copy, so I've had a little time to go through and digest it, but is exploring that idea of the secular and that concern, I think, which was running through the book around things that are not focused on necessarily as focused on the inner life or a focus on, say, transcendence or nirvana, but instead of focus outward for this life and for this world. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about the connection between the Dharma and sort of social and political issues, where those connections lie?
Well, sure. I mean, the basic connection is that is ethics, because I mean, whatever version of Buddhism you take up, it begins with ethics. So the Eightfold Path is traditionally divided into three parts: ethics, meditation, and wisdom. So by cultivating an inner life that brings that also primarily cultivates a set of ethics, one who immediately comes out into seeing how these ethics should apply to the world as the world we live in. That if these ethics were applied to the world we live in, then we would be on the way to solving these two great crises that we have of global warming and galloping social inequalities. So these are not two diverging focuses, but they are converging focuses. Or I suppose, put it in a better way, if one cultivates the inner life on an ethical basis, then you immediately evoke the issues that are out there in the world.
That's good. So with the topics that you'd raised in that second part of the book, you spend some time looking at issues around climate change and even go into an exploration of Pope Francis's ecumenical on climate change. To what extent is that connection as well between climate change and the Dharma?
Well, it comes from the fact that the fundament of Buddhist ethics is care. That is the basic ethical position of the Dharma, and the Buddha put it very well by saying it was the care, or appamata in the Pali language, the canonical language in which his teaching is couched. Appamata is like the footprint of an elephant, and that footprint can contain the footprint of any other animal that walks the earth. And in the same way, care contains and is the springboard of all the ethical principles and the virtues that the Dharma practice will evoke, that will cultivate. So if we care, then we've got to care for starting with our own self, then moving out to those who are closest to us, but we keep moving further and further out until it includes everyone we share this biosphere with. So that is the connection, and it's very interesting that that the Pope, in his encyclical on this, after the Latin main title, he follows up with the subtitle, "The Care of Our Common Home." And so there's that word care turning up immediately. And what's really groundbreaking about this encyclical is that it's basically telling the Catholic faithful that it's not enough to go to Mass on Sunday. They have to really get active around these two great issues of climate change and social injustice, and just to do so in a way that see how they're linked, how these two crises are linked. So it completely breaks down that idea that it's enough just to be a pious Catholic, and for that matter, a pious Buddhist who, does what they're supposed to do as spiritual practice, and then is oblivious to the world they live in.
Yeah, as a comment, I thought that focus was really quite strong throughout the book. The idea that it really wasn't enough to just sort of focus on your inner life, but in focusing on your inner life, you really also have to focus on the world around you, the climate, income inequality, social injustice, racial injustice. That came through very strongly. So I think it's wonderful as that sort of second part of the book. One thing I'd like to come back to, though, is that sort of the first part of the book, which is a discussion on Buddhism and its progress, I suppose, from the last 2,500 years or so from the death of the Buddha. Would you like to just perhaps briefly outline? I think one of the key important parts of your book was that point where Buddhism reached the West, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that point when Buddhism was first introduced to the West and where it's gotten to from there.
Yes, well, one of the interesting aspects of this connection is that Buddhism only became Buddhism when Westerners discovered it, discovered in scare quotes. There was no concept of Buddhism until a Frenchman wrote a book about it in the early 19th century. And so, Buddhism developed as or what came to be known as Buddhism in the 19th century, developed in quite scattered ethnic and national situations that had no contact with each other. So it was by being noticed by Westerners that Buddhism as a kind of supposedly monolithic or coherent tradition came about. Now, I think that that it's still a very dodgy concept, Buddhism, because it covers such disparate kinds of traditions. But in the West, it was received as something that was coherent, and it became almost immediately involved in the great debate between Charles Darwin and the evolutionary biologists that he inspired, and Christian theology, because Christianity has its myth of origins in the Garden of Eden, and the world on that account is only 5,000 years old. And here were these unruly characters, Charles Darwin's mob, who were saying, sorry, but it's millions of years old, and the whole Garden of Eden thing doesn't make sense. So Buddhism became, for those who wanted a religious experience, a religious life, here was something that came along that had no myth of origins, and therefore could sit quite easily with evolutionary biology. And on that basis, it was often called the scientific religion, because on the rather shaky ground that it had no argument at all with evolutionary biology, which had become a glamour discipline. And it also seemed to be relevant to the other great glamour discipline of the late 19th century, which was psychology. So, because Buddhism was concerned with the mind and the dynamics of mind, psychologists thought, yeah, well, here are a bunch of colleagues who we can talk to about the mind. And that reinforced the idea of Buddhism as a scientific religion. Now, it wasn't, in fact, it wasn't so much a scientific religion as simply it was an imagined monolithic religion that had no arguments with science, but in that way, it began to attract some rather interesting, some quite interesting converts, and in particular two characters who were upper class Englishmen who were military intelligence officers during the Second World War. And they became really interested in Buddhism actually during the war itself. And when the war ended, they were demobilized and met in a London pub and said, what do we do with our lives now? I mean, obviously working for a living was nothing they'd contemplated because they were both very rich. So they went off to Sri Lanka and became Buddhist monks. And that was a very important turning point, at least in the English-speaking world. One of them became a very serious scholar of aspects of the Pali Canon, which dealt with the Buddha's own life. The life of the Buddha had never been written. So this particular one, Yanamali, wrote the history of the biography of the Buddha based on the Pali Canon. The other one, Jnanavira, was really became the father of secular Buddhism. He too became a very exacting Pali scholar who began to criticize the kinds of interpretations and translations of vital texts in the Pali Canon, and in particular the Buddha's first discourse. And he was the first one to say, look, this is not talking about four noble truths at all. It's talking about four tasks. It's talking about injunctions, four injunctions. And he actually compared it to Alice in Wonderland and that moment when Alice falls down the rabbit hole and there's a bottle of medicine on the table and the label simply says, drink me. It doesn't say the active ingredients of this is this and that, but it just says, do something. And so this was the beginning of understanding Buddhism as a task-based ethical practice. Everything else followed from that correction to correction of the first discourse, really. And for a long time, that remained fairly dormant. Jnanavira was writing in the 1960s, but then along came what came to the West and what became very popular in the West was a thing called, that scholars have called Buddhist modernism, which was a kind of compromise of ancestral Buddhism and certain modern kinds of ideas, which made it much more comprehensible for Westerners. Actually, Buddhist modernism was first invented in the late 19th century in Burma and Sri Lanka to head off Protestant missionaries who were trying to win converts to Christianity from Buddhists. And the Buddhist response to that was to tear a page out of the Protestants' playbook. So they gave much more credence, and much more, I suppose, status to lay practice, and making practices that until then had only been available to monks available to the laity. And that is what became the leading edge of Buddhism as it gained converts in the West from about the 1960s. So most of the forms of Buddhism that my generation got involved in were like this. They were kind of a bit modern. They looked modern. They spoke Western languages, but there was still a lot of the old deference to authority. The same age-old institutions were coming in as the vehicles of Buddhist modernism, and that created a lot of incoherence. So another way of understanding the origins of secular Buddhism is that it tackles that incoherence at the heart of Buddhist modernism, and in that way deconstructs the religious aspect of it, including the religious institutions, the religious forms of organisation that weren't helping Westerners to actually get into the core meaning of the practice.
I think one thing which was very interesting reading it was considering those points of connection where the appeal for Westerners in starting to take up Buddhism, even if in its religious form. One thing which I note in the book is a certain level of caution around sort of the scientism, science, and an over focus on science, or an attempt to validate Buddhism through a scientific lens. I wondered if you had any comment on that.
Yeah, I think that started when Stephen Batchelor was getting ready to publish Confession of a Buddhist Atheist from memory in 2010. And it was being directed primarily at the American market. And in America, you had then and still have this enormous debate between the so-called the new atheists and the people who have traditional religious, usually Abrahamic religious views. It was, in a way, this is a bit like the debate between the evolutionary biologists and the Christian theologians in the 19th century. So in the publishing of Confession of a Buddhist Atheist, first of all was, what was the word atheist doing in the title? And then the other thing was on the dust jacket was an endorsement by Christopher Hitchens, who was one of the leaders of the new atheist movement. I suppose a number of us reacted to that because it was, really Buddhists don't have a dog in the fight about whether God exists or doesn't exist. It's not about that, and it seemed to be that that there was a danger that secular Buddhism would be drawn into this kind of scientific, new atheist way of thinking, when really the affinities that the Dharma has in the West is with a completely other set of thinkers, the post-Nietzschean, post-metaphysical thinkers, like the metaphysical thinkers, existentialists, and so on. So I suppose, there's one of the essays in the book is about this, about whether we're going to take, whether we're going to go back to this idea of being a scientific religion or a scientific non-religion, and join the good fight against unscientific attitudes of religious folk, or were we going to take what seemed to be a much more fruitful approach, which was to draw out these affinities between Dharma and phenomenology and American pragmatic philosophy and so on, which is about the interpretation of the human condition, and particularly as we experience it directly. So using the Dharma instead to parse our experience as meditators and as reflective human beings in the world. So that seemed to be the sort of the difference. I mean, and in some ways you can, the difference is one created by national cultural differences. I mean, there's a far higher level of religious adherence and belief in America than there is in the rest of the Western world. So, the new atheists didn't really cut it for outside of America. It just didn't seem to be relevant to secular people who didn't think it was an interesting debate.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the, you did it in sort of quite a witty, almost quite perceptive way of addressing that difference between people from North America and people from Commonwealth or European countries in the book. It helped to explain for me why every time often when I'm talking to American secular Buddhists, one of the first things they say when they're describing their background is to also add in that they're an atheist or an agnostic, which made them out as much sense as describing what color car they have or something like that. It didn't really add very much. But one thing I'd like to explore a little bit more, though, is that idea of those the affinities between Buddhism and Western philosophy. And in the book, you've, like Stephen Batchelor, you've noted those connections between them, especially pragmatism and phenomenology. For an audience of non-philosophers, how would you sort of describe that affinity, and what do you think? What impact do you think it has on secular Buddhist practice?
Well, let's start with Heidegger,
As you do.
who's phenomenally difficult, but there's a very simple idea in Heidegger which fits perfectly with the Dharma and with the experience of insight meditation. And that is that everything is in process. Heidegger objected to the whole idea of seeing human beings as enduring entities. I mean, it has a superficial cogency that, I go to sleep tonight, tomorrow I'll wake up and I'll still be who I am. But really, when you look very carefully at our experience, it's just a matter of things arising and passing away, arising and passing away. This is the refrain in the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the Buddha's main teaching on meditation. And we can see this, especially if you go on a 10-day intensive insight retreat, this is what you see. And at the end, you've made hundreds or thousands of notations of experiences, but there's no choreographer, there's no director of it. And this is exactly what Heidegger is getting at, that instead of talking about human beings as entities, he's talking about beings as verbs, that it's a question of being in the world, of being there. And this is always a matter of a dynamic process. So in that way, of course, it's matching up with the Buddha's use of the term not self, anatta, which is not a metaphysical proposition, but an experience. If we look very carefully, there is no concrete self that we can really capture. So Heidegger is the godfather, if you like, of both phenomenologists and existentialists. And then as far as pragmatism is concerned, we're talking about John Dewey and leading up to Rorty as Richard Rorty as the most recent important pragmatist thinker. And here you get the same sort of idea, except that what they are saying is that thoughts, ideas, etc., should be tested according to their usefulness, not according to some idea that they are ultimately they reflect some sort of reality. So, in a way, if you look at the way science develops, you can see this the whole time, that a theory works fine for a while, but after a while, once applied, it doesn't work so well. So then something else comes along. There's always the issue of human well-being, of human flourishing. So in that way, as a kind of way of testing truth claims, this was also very close to the Buddha's way of working. He abhorred metaphysical propositions. He didn't want to engage on whether God existed or not, or whether the self existed or not. He just said, look at your experience. And it's also, in terms of a lot of the teachings he gave and a lot of the lists he produced for the use of practitioners were really just practical guides. And we use them because they work, not because they're about some sort of ultimate truth. And to go back to I suppose, what is the central question of debate between secular Buddhists and conventional Buddhists, is that issue of the Four Noble Truths interpretation versus the four tasks. And if you're into the metaphysical mode, you've got to take on board these Four Noble Truths as ultimate statements of truth, whereas in pragmatist mode, you can see the four tasks as drink me, do this, do that, because this is what you need to do to flourish as a human being. So does that help?
It does help, yes. Yeah, I thought it was an incredible array in the book of your consideration and analysis of different philosophers and thinkers. I think you had Freud in there as well. I think Nietzsche makes an appearance. The whole sort of Protestant Reformation sort of gets a look into is an incredibly well-researched book in terms of its analysis of other philosophers and thinkers. One which jumped out at me was there's a chapter in the book that focuses on Martin Haglin's 2020 book, This Life. Why do you think that book was important? And what do you think it has to say to secular Buddhists?
I think it's enormously important for secular Buddhists. In a way, it sort of it challenges us to stop being wishy-washy or sitting on the fence about certain issues like rebirth. Hägglund is saying, look, death is final, and he's not the first one to say this. And you've got to accept that proposition in order to make sense of your life. I mean, Heidegger said this too, that to live authentically, you have to accept your finitude. Not just the fact that we're mortal, and our lives are bookended by birth and death, but that we've got limited possibilities depending upon where we're born and our gender, etc. But ultimately, as human beings, that we are going to fade away. And on that, it's only once you accept that you can develop what Hägglund calls secular faith. Often, I mean, in our, I think, pre-Hägglundian way, we thought faith is something that religious folk have, and it's usually faith in something timeless, something redemptive. But Hägglund takes us into what faith actually means. It means commitment. It means conversion to something that is fundamentally life-changing. And here he quotes quite properly people who've talked about faith, like St. Augustine and Kierkegaard, who was another very devoted Christian, but who was also an existentialist philosopher. Faith is what drives us to make the most of our lives. And a secular faith is then one that is committed to making the most of this life, understanding that it is going to come to an end. And it's not the coming to an end isn't the bad news, because it is actually giving us a framework to work with, how we commit ourselves to our relationships, to our relationships to the people closest to us, but our relationship to other things that are equally mortal, equally capable of failing. And it's the fact that they are always at risk, always at stake, that makes them appropriate objects of our loyalty and our commitment. If everyone we loved was going to live forever, and everything we thought was valuable was going to stay forever, we wouldn't care. We wouldn't carry that enormous challenge of caring for things that we do if we have secular faith. And then the final part of his argument is, it is only when you have this kind of secular faith and abandon what he calls religious faith, that is commitment to things that are not of this world, not of this time, that you can exercise spiritual freedom. And that is spiritual freedom is not only the choice of what to believe or what to accept or what to commit to, but the choice of how to do that. What is the best way for me to act out my secular faith? And that freedom he sees as incredibly precious. And so that's why his book, he's got these three focuses that are in the title. This life, understood, the only life we're ever going to have, secular faith and spiritual freedom. So that's why it's important.
That's good. Thank you. I've just got one more question just before I pass it over to the audience for some questions from there. But at One Mindful Breath, we're always interested in improving and deepening our meditation and mindfulness practice. And in the book, you're somewhat critical of formulaic versions of meditation. How in your view is a secular approach different when it comes to the act of meditating?
Well, it's not particularly. It's not a specifically secular approach. As a number of people who have practiced and to some extent still do practice in ancestral Buddhist forms, like Barry McGee, the Zen teacher, and Jason Siff, the Insight meditation teacher, are also advocating this kind of form of meditation that is freewheeling, that is not driven by certain specific formulaic instructions. And indeed, in the Zen tradition, you've got the just sitting, shikantaza, which is this kind of meditation that is most associated, I guess, with secular Buddhism. So in this form of meditation, you are, as Barry McGee says, inviting the mind to display its contents. So whatever comes along, whatever experience you're having in your meditation period is part of your meditation. It is what is happening right now. And that is as opposed to formulaic forms of meditation. To take the Mahasi method as an example, where you have a primary object and a secondary object, and once you and if you follow this set of instructions, you're being essentially told to disregard, to cull any part of your experience which is not the target of the instructions. So a whole lot of your experience then gets defined as not meditation, and it's a strange kind of conclusion, because whatever you experience is part of your life, and particularly as lay Westerners, we lead complicated lives, and these are going to show up. They're going to be refracted in our meditation experience, and it seems to be counterproductive to make this division between what is meditation and what is not meditation. So it's one of Jason Siff's little pieces of advice, that whatever happens after you start meditating is part of your meditation, and that's a very important aspect of using your meditation to get in close and get in deeper into what your experience actually is.
That's good. Well, I hope some of these questions are highlighting the sort of the sheer range of different topics that are covered in Revamp, discussing the background of Buddhism, the philosophy, its interactions with Western philosophy, a range of different topics on the individual's practice, also around sanghas and around communities, and then that exploration of the outside world, the secular world, and Buddhists' interaction with that. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to open it up to the floor for anyone to ask Winton a question. It could be on any of those topics, or if you've had a chance to read the book, you might already have a different topic or question of your own. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start firstly, just for the sake of order, I'm going to start with the people who are physically present here in Wellington, Aotearoa. And what we'll do then is we'll then pass it over to see if anyone has any questions via Zoom. So firstly, I'll just check here if anyone has any questions. Yeah, we've got a question. So I'm just going to move the video along so that we can get to the questioner. And
There's one on the chat. Yeah, up to you who goes first.
oh, there's one on. Oh, was there a chat question as well?
But
Oh, we'll do the physical question first.
So we're talking about I'm next. We're talking about secular faith, and that's something that I like I guess a phrase or a description that resonates with me. And I wondered if it seems to me that Buddhism is not the only source of secular faith. There's other kinds of schools of thought or practices that lead to that. Do you have any other ideas of different schools of thought or religions or things that end up at some kind of secular faith?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there'll be lots. I mean, there's the important point about a secular faith is that it changes your life. It becomes a focus of who you are in the world and what you do. So, in one obvious example would be Marxism, which is clearly secular, which is clearly a doctrine for mortal human beings, and people really do commit to it. But there are many others that I imagine. I mean, you could even say that medicine might be a secular faith for those who are not just medicos for careerist reasons, but who've got a burning passion, to cure disease, or something like that. I mean, there was a lot of. I think there's in countries which have had a particularly bad time with the COVID pandemic. You've seen a lot of people of secular faith, and in the staff of hospitals, the people who've got standing ovations, from people in the street. I think these are. I mean, this is all about secular faith. They're not. They're not driven by ideas of some sort of afterlife or some sort of redemption in a timeless sphere, but they are really, really committed to mortal life and mortal flourishing.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. If I can see what this question is. Sorry, I'll just put that over there for a second. I'll just see if I can. Where's the chat? Oh, it's down here. So Winton Vivian asks, which ideas do you find helpful in taking climate action?
Well, Greta Thunberg's ideas, I think, in short. I think it's really important that we get away from the pseudo solutions, like the kind that the Australian government carries on with. That we just need a technology. Technology will save us. We don't have to change anything. We don't have to change the mode of production. We don't have to change our ways of life. But we're going to have this miracle of carbon capture, which means we can go on burning coal and go on doing everything we're doing now, but the problem will go away. So I'm with Greta and with the Pope that we are being challenged to change things in a massive way, and particularly, of course, the rapid development of renewables and the closing down of carbon fuels. And I guess that's the main thrust. I mean, I think this is really important, and this is why I feel a great solidarity with movements like Extinction Rebellion.
So did anyone have any questions for the questions here in Wellington or Winton on any of those topics that we've discussed? Cool. I'll open it up then to anyone on Zoom who would like to ask a question. You just need to unmute yourself
So Despina's raised a hand on Zoom.
Oh yeah, Despina, do you have a question?
Winton, that was wonderful to listen to. I just want to ask you a question. Given the two existential crises that you've highlighted tonight that we face, which is very true, social inequality and climate change, if you were to crystal ball gaze and look forward, how do you think secular Buddhism may evolve over the next decade as a practice or on a philosophical level?
I think it's developing rather slowly, as in terms of its doctrine, if you like. But I think it's going to become much more socially activist. I've noticed that quite a few of my Dharma friends here are getting involved in things like Extinction Rebellion, or the climate strike that's going to occur in a couple of days' time. And I think more and more the people are going to be taking up social and political activism and understanding it as part of their Dharma practice. That's very optimistic, but I hope it's true.
Thank you.
Were there any other questions on Zoom? Okay. Well, as we have no further questions, what I thought we'd do is just say, firstly, a huge thank you to Winton for taking the time to talk about his book. I would like to also strongly plug the book. So it is available for sale, both physically here in Wellington. So we've got copies that are available, and you can also find it online through the Tuwhiri bookshop. You'll be able to find the details of that in the event, which you would have found for finding this event even happening. So do think about buying the book. It does cover an enormous range of different topics, and I certainly found it an incredibly worthwhile read, and certainly a rousing call to action as well on things like climate change and inequality. So thank you again, Winton. Let's have a round of applause, and you can.
Thank you, Alex. That was they were good questions, and thank you for everyone for coming along to the launch. And now enjoy your wine and cheese.
Yeah,
We will.
Well, I will. I'll end it there, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.